Helene Servillon. I'm founding partner of JourneyOne Ventures. I will hand it off to my amazing co-panelists to do intros, but JourneyOne, we are a early stage focused cannabis fund. So primarily do seed investments, a touch of pre-seed. And we are focused on what I define as the venture scalable sectors of the market. So primarily lean heavy on tech. I come from an enterprise tech background, but also a background in emerging industries. So I like the cowboy, cowgirl fun. And we are going through the thick of that right now this year. And this panel is on emerging problems in solution and technology, which there are a lot in cannabis. And Rose, kick it off. Sure. Well, actually, here, question for you. So name your company and what problem are you solving in the market with your company?
The company is Komplyd, and we are solving the problem of challenges of cannabis compliance data standardization with the track and trace systems. And by solving for that, we're also solving for the technical fragmentation and non-interoperability. So Komplyd is a compliance and operability digital middleware layer for the cannabis industry.
Awesome. John.
I'm John Derham. I'm founder of a company called EASL. EASL is it's a middleware stack, highly focused in the cannabis industry, and we integrate platforms to platforms, processes to processes, and move data effectively. Part of the problems that we see in the space that we solve for, at least initially, is removing friction points. And we move our processes very cost effectively and very quickly. So if you're thinking about doing integrations that would need to be scheduled and take multiple periods and months of planning, we can knock that stuff out in weeks, so days and weeks. So we like to think that we're bringing a lot of our collective experience from other highly regulated industries that we've worked in into the processes of the cannabis industry as it evolves.
So I like to characterize these companies as whatever 2.0, 3.0 cannabis tech. It's the next generation of cannabis technology. And a lot of it has to do with infrastructure.
Totally.
And also just creating more integration across the ecosystem, which I think a lot of us learned a lot about in terms of what those roadblocks are. So before we talk about all the problems in the world, we can literally sit here for the rest of 2023. Let's talk about the state of the market. And it's no surprise we're obviously in a recession holistically, and that creates a lot of crunch for cannabis. But how do we look at where the industry's at from the software side and the effects of the recession? So let's talk about that, and also data and compliance issues, because that is the core of where your company sit.
Well, the current state from a technical standpoint is, the evolution of cannabis technology. The first players that came in were people that were extremely passionate about the plant, but not necessarily extremely experienced in current technology, coming from large tech players. And then more people came in with some experience, but still the technical ecosystem is relatively immature compared to other industries. And so now what you're seeing now is some of the more seasoned technical and business players coming in that either one have a passion for the plant or just really excited about the space.
So when we talk about not as technically advanced, right, relative to what big tech, deep tech, all the, let's be specific in terms of how far back we are. And also, I think you didn't flex a little bit on your background, but
yeah, I didn't realize that was my intro, by the way. I thought just say the problem.
Yeah, we'll also go to John's background, but yeah. Rose comes from a very seasoned expertise in the tech industry.
Yeah, so my background is have over 2 decades of engineering and product development and leadership in highly regulated industries and very large tech companies that many of you have heard of. I've delivered large-scale platforms, et cetera, across PayPal, eBay, Netflix, Upwork, used to be Odesk, amongst others, and a couple smaller company startups you probably haven't heard of. And yeah, and it's an extremely challenging problem to solve. It's requires significant infrastructure. It requires common data models. It requires universal APIs, whether you're building for internal teams or external. And it's a lot of work. It's a heavy, heavy lift. It's not for the faint of heart. Modern technology is making it somewhat easier. If you're in like AWS or the GCP Azure, you can put together these, you can stitch together these things. They do a multitude of services that they offer, but it's still extremely complex. And but when you build a platform like that, or a platform as a product that I like to call it, you're doing the heavy, challenging work, but you're making it dead simple for your user. And I've done this in multiple companies, at cybersecurity companies as well, where we did one, and they literally were able to sell their company for a lot of value because of a team built. Basically, they could build up a new product in 20 minutes.
Yeah. So when we look at EASL's core value add to the market, and specifically timing of why your company needs to exist now versus then versus 5 years, how do you look at timeline and the problem that you guys are solving in the market, and for who?
So we entered the market about a year ago. So we weren't around 5 years ago when systems were being built. And we entered it with an intellectual curiosity that we felt as though the massive the compounded annual growth rate of the industry and the fragmentation of state by state operators wasn't going to lend itself to major enterprise solutions. So my DNA and a lot of the DNA at EASL comes from payment services industry, Visa, MasterCard, high volume transaction processing, massive scale issues, massive data, but then also the data being used within that industry to inform everybody about how everything works, whether it's risk management, it's marketing, segmentation, product pricing, right? So the infrastructure that supports the financial services world has data at every possible node that is used in every possible way, largely because a lot of the players in that industry collaborate. And they have standards and they have rigid processes, which also promotes an effective oversight and regulatory view, right? So as we looked at the opportunity in cannabis, we said, boy, that's going to be screwed up. And from an operating perspective, and we like challenges and we like fixing things. So as we stepped in, we saw really mature edges of businesses, but application layers themselves were built very effectively for the markets and the functions that they were performing at the time. As you scale out, states break down, new ERPs get created, new point of sale. There's an incredible amount of friction that's present in the old operating players that kind of builds itself into, it could be tech debt in some regards, but it just could be inertia in others. And that's the problem that we solve. I have a lot of experience in other industries as well, fixing these things. Everything I see in this industry getting to 2.0, 3.0 is very, very fixable. There's not a lot of data here. There's a lot, but it's in the scheme of things, it's not a massive data issue. It's an integration and collaboration issue, I see.
I agree.
Yeah, and so I think that touches up on the current ecosystem today and fragmentation. What are there benefits to fragmentation? And what does the ideal ecosystem look like in terms of the next 2 years? And how do you find yourself playing an influence in that ideal ecosystem?
We ask ourselves that question all the time, and it changes, right? And I look back to when I started in the banking industry, the savings and loan industry had failed, and it was a massive, huge hiccup in the banking systems in the late 80s, early 90s. But at that same time, the chilling effect of that, but also the reality of interstate banking, took banks into a position to fix their infrastructure at that time. They weren't massively creating market share. Everybody went to Delaware and incorporated in Delaware and usury laws. But at the same time, big companies like First Data Resources, Total Systems, were building massively scalable infrastructure that was replacing, paper franking, right? And so it feels like you have, certain points of time where you have the opportunity to fix the infrastructure and the systems that have to scale 3, 4, 5x in their own states, even before the state walls break down, because that's the real opportunity. Is when people start seeing the real scale and safe banking and other investment. You're going to see a lot of money come in here, and they're not going to expect things to stumble and fumble again. They're going to say, I want you to be operating like an enterprise grade platform. So we feel like our presence in this market as an independent third party that's trusted. We don't have a horse in the race on, any part of the industry other than lifting the whole industry. Our company's name, EASL, is literally, we see ourselves holding up artwork, right? The plumbing and the piping of what we do is less important than the cannabis industry itself, but someone's got to do it. So we like this place where we want to be. We want to be collaborative and work with folks and solve solutions that help everybody in the ecosystem.
Any comments or?
For me?
Yeah.
I couldn't agree more. When you mentioned the problem we're solving, one of the biggest problems with fragmentation or standardization is the track and trace data. When you're, as everyone knows, you have to report into the state contracted track and trace system, whether it's proprietary they built or it's one that they've partnered with. And they're different. And they're different even when it's the same system. If it's going to another state, it won't be the same company. It's a different instance, and it's different. And they're antiquated. They were early. They were early adopting, early players. They're building changing the wheels while the train's going, and they're all making their changes now. But it's really, really, really complex. It's really expensive. And additionally, they're reporting tools. So what we've done is we've built this digital compliance layer. It's a universal API. It's a common data model. Literally one API, every single jurisdiction, and the data itself is the same, and you can actually get the data out, because you really can't, even these systems, the operators can't get all the data out. Mm-hmm. And then they can't, with us, they can actually get it out. One API that can get all of their data for every vertical in every jurisdiction that they're operating in.
And I think, I don't know if you guys were in the last couple of panels, but we talked a lot about standardization, even with like inventory management, UCC codes, cataloging. And, Snavis and Beeflink were up here, and they, it's like, who's going to solve that problem and whose responsibility is it in the supply chain? And, a lot of what I heard was, which I agree to, is like garbage in, garbage out. So first point of entry needs to kind of be that gatekeeper for the rest of the ecosystem to benefit off that. But the fact that, this industry is already, $250 billion legally, and we haven't even got there yet. Imagine how much work we're going to have to just reverse back into eventually, because we eventually need to get there.
Right. And in the last panel I was just in was called Open Ecosystem. And there's a lot of companies, kind of saying that they're pushing towards that. But if I have to use your product to be able to integrate something else, and it's not a true open ecosystem. And so, and I'm very passionate, a fan of open ecosystems, as well as standardizations and like the W3 consortium, et cetera. And if you're an individual, like for us, you could say, well, Rose, if you put this thing out and they're integrating through you, you're kind of there. I have a dream of a single pane of glass where a person could go in and just choose the tools they want and be utilizing it. And even though I'm not saying we have to be those rails, we could be those rails because we add a lot of other value. But if we put together that consortium, like I have been talking to EASL and other companies, we come up with W3 is the World Wide Web. They have a consortium back in the day when you developed for a browser. It was horrendous. It was actually called the most hostile development environment in the world. Every single browser and every single version was different. And there were no standards. And then people from the top companies, the Googles, the Microsofts, the eBays, got together, created engineers, et cetera, in a consortium, came up with these standards. And that is what this industry needs. Again, it takes time and money from it, and it requires people from different organizations. No one company can push that.
So that's one solution to one of our 20 billion problems. And I think like backgrounds that you guys come from is so interesting, but also important, because you bring in that knowledge of pain points of other markets that are massive today that have emerged from very similar, rails of cannabis.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I worked in a number of different banks in different parts of the world, and highly regulatory environments are a reality in the cannabis industry, whether they're present or not now. Right? And I think that, you know, of all the audits that I've gone through and good, not so good in others, but they're all lessons that would begin and end with the availability and the accuracy, transparency of your data, right? And you know, and I talk to CEOs about, you know, how the auditors and how the regulators are dealing with them. They're like, oh, they don't bother me. I said, have they showed up yet? And he said, no, they haven't showed up yet. You know, and it comes down to things like, you know, the regulators don't want to see reports. They want to see reports and the data that created those reports, because they don't trust you. And so the availability of data outside of all the commercial areas becomes a really important factor in bringing stability in the cannabis industry. Now, as Ryan Tolkien said yesterday in his keynote speech, he said, you know, government needs regulatory oversight to make investors feel comfortable. Investors don't want to come into an environment without a fair amount of regulatory oversight and controls and rules. So one feeds the other, you know, so we could talk about all these incredible business opportunities we can create with data transparency and standards, because regulators love standards. They love them. But at the same time, if you don't have those standards in place, they'll shut you down, right? Because your cowboy antics over here aren't consistent with their best policies. So it's two sides of a coin. And I think that it's in an interesting time. I think conferences like this that bring data to the forefront and the attention are really important, because it's, you know, all the biomass in the world could be locked up in a container, not being allowed to be sold because somebody doesn't like the regulatory approach that certain folks are doing. And in reality, you're going to have to deal with both state regulators as well as federal. And they like to do things two different ways as well. So data is the king that helps promote all of that.
I'd like to add to that, and like you said, state and federal, it actually goes down to the local level. Rules and regulations and compliance in cannabis and in other highly regulated industries are literally a patchwork of legislation at every level of government, and it's constantly changing. And when interstate commerce comes in, there isn't a system out today that could actually support it. And that's when we talk about the fragmentation. That's a major problem that fragmentation causes or contributes to. And so when you're talking about an enterprise class platform that's holistic and horizontal across the entire industry, it's literally, for us, it's a transaction that would have rules and regulations at 3 levels on each end of the transaction. It's already supported out of the box.
Well, there isn't currently, well, moving towards that, you know, it's what Komplyd's doing.
Right. You literally can't do interstate commerce today, but there's a lot of people out there putting their efforts in lobbying, et cetera. And Gavin Newsom, I'm from California. He's really pushing, the whole West Coast is pushing for it. And if and when, I'm not a lawyer, so they say that it really doesn't break the law
Sure.
But we'll see what happens. But eventually, whether through treaties or lobbying or actual federal legalization, it will be there, and it needs to be supported like right away. And right now, with the capital markets and things happening, businesses should be preparing for when federal legalization or any kind of accelerated legalization happens again. Yeah. And by that, invest in the technology that will help you reduce your costs, increase your revenue, and explode.
Yeah, I mean, I think big traditional tech, I've spent a lot of time with a lot of the corporate executives at, you know, Shopify, Square's name, I forget. Block. You know, Uber, DoorDash was supposed to be here. Financial institutions, I bank with a federal institutional bank. They know I'm a cannabis fund. I think I'm the only one in their portfolio. But the question of compliance and regulation and whether or not they even are allowed to bank cannabis is more of, do they want to go through the pain process of doing it versus can they actually like legally do it yet? So what I mean to say is that everybody is, there's going to be a bridge and it's going to happen really fast. And we don't have the infrastructure today. And so in terms of like legacy platforms, this new age of platforms, where there's a lot of technical debt in the industry. I'd love to jump into this conversation. And from your perspective, where do you think a lot of this technical debt is sitting? Will it ever go away? Or, what's our approach to
So
topic?
I have strong opinions on it. So I think the technical debt, David Campos did a really good session yesterday explaining what it is. And for those of, it's basically the inefficiencies of your technology infrastructure that won't allow you to scale the way you want to. Some people say it's like changing the wing on an airplane when it's in the sky. We have to land the plane and we have to fix it, right? Technical debt, and per David's definition, was actually, you're balancing your market fit for your development with your timeline and cost of development, right? So I'm going to not build a completely compliant and scalable environment when I'm doing a proof of concept. Proof of concept gets rolling and then it gets momentum. And next thing you know, it's not going to scale up. And there's different versions of that that cause it. A lot of them are largely attributed to the key features of what you're building of your platform. And the features may not have encompassed the interoperability with how you're going to operate with other players in your ecosystem, right? Mm-hmm. And so what you need to do is consider, retiring some of your technical debt by rewriting portions of it. It doesn't mean boiling the ocean and doing it all at the same time. But what it does mean is it look into your strategy and those areas of your platforms that have to scale out and might need to grow by 2 or 3x, and consider options on it. Consider rewriting, buying new equipment, buying partnership, using, third-party cloud-based environments to help with disk or processing. But it's really a strategy around where you want to go and try to retire it. I think there's always going to be technical debt. It's just the way that we build environments. But at EASL, we have a mindset of retiring as much of it as we build. So we are relentlessly optimistic that the things that we're going to do tomorrow are going to be better than what we need right now. So we break everything out of the gate.
I think a good way to frame the same topic with you, Rose, is I'd love to have you walk us through a case study of how you alleviate technical debt for partners that you work with, because I think the question is buy versus build, right? You take on debt if you build, and that's then you have to take on a lot of responsibility to upkeep.
Right. I want to first say technical debt, as John stated, there's no escaping it. It's just the level of how much technical debt you assume.
What is level? What is it?
Level is
level versus a not healthy level.
Healthy level is if you're following best practices in agile development, you're not building, you may have a vision of which product will be in several years or a year or whatever, but you're not building for that. You're building what you need today, but you understand where that is. And the model that I've done extreme programming, etc. The model is refactor. So you're constantly refactoring. When you're building a new feature, you're refactoring it as you go. And so you don't end up with this huge ball of spaghetti is what we like to call it. When I went to PayPal, we were in the process of refactoring everything. And they had thousands and thousands and thousands of lines of code that nobody knew and everybody was afraid to touch. And they, over years, multiple years, pulled that apart. I did it at Netflix as well. We had one method that was over 1,000 lines of code. No one wanted to touch. And every time we touched it, and it took time to refactor it. Mm-hmm. But if you're developing, following the best practices to begin with, you'll still have to do the refactoring, but you do little bits as you're going along, rather than going, I have to dump this whole thing and rewrite it. Mm-hmm. And that's what I'm hearing from some of the players today in the space is they have to re-platform.
Yeah.
their platform.
Scary for investors.
And what that means is they have to rewrite it, the whole thing. And that's
scary
really
for
expensive,
investors.
really time consuming and fragile.
I think one of the factors that creates it is when you have a fractured cannabis ecosystem like we have state by state, software companies building solutions that might overly benefit what's happening in California or Colorado. And without the collaborative nature, you tend to get a lot of different companies trying to solve the same problems different ways. So when you get to the point where you say, oh, we have to connect these tissues in between these companies, you have a standoff. And those issues could be built more clearly if you had collaborative upfront contemplating interoperability and integrations. And we feel like the technical debt can be remediated quicker if there's collaboration and third parties helping.
Gotcha. So, I think from an investor standpoint, we've talked about data, hygiene, culture. One of the biggest things I see with, end consumers and meaning the operators is just lack of data strategy and not having the right talent on board to make those decisions. Some sophisticated organizations like, AIR and MariMed prioritize that. And so that's kind of like the ideal world that we live in versus the reality of the world that we live in. Another topic of problem areas, or not problem areas, just more of kind of like, love to hear how you think about this is when you're looking at platform partners and, as an early stage startup, you can't be everything for everybody at once with such a low budget. You kind of have to have like a crawl, walk, run philosophy. And I always look at and assess like companies, like, are you a product, a feature, or a platform? And at some point, what are you going to be? And how is consolidation going to roll up? Are you going to have to roll up under one? Or are you going to be a top co? That's kind of how I build my thesis around like, who's going to be the top players in the sector? Because I firmly believe that in cannabis, we're looking at maybe top 5, top 6 globally tech players. So everyone's going to have to roll up somehow. And so I'm curious to where we are in the industry right now. How do you make those assessments with your strategies and pushing your companies forward?
We are aware of there are a lot of platforms out there, more than the market can handle. And I think that we are focusing on the ones that we believe are going to persist.
And which categories do you feel like are over built in?
Point of sale, it's pretty overbuilt with a lot of different feature sets that don't really provide core functionality. They might provide some unique little thing that you could do. But I think we spend a lot of time in the wholesale space, and we like the wholesale space because it provides us lots of lines of sight to the growers, to the products, to the retailers. And there's a lot of data that moves through there. We do believe that, wholesaling will be a much bigger, much more transactional once federalization happens. And it'll be a big part of it. I think the seed to sale on the other side might be a little bit overdone as well from the number of platforms. I like to think about the industry simplifying it. We move biomass products from one end of the ecosystem to a consumer consumption. And it has logical steps of growing, productization, ERP, wholesale distribution, consumer demand, and consumption, right? So it's, we're not splitting an atom here. It's fairly standard. In a prior life, I worked in e-tail with Overstock. We did the same thing. We provided services and drop shipping and marketing and features, not as highly regulated, but it was the same concept. And the goal of that business is frictionless throughput. And a lot of players in the industry that have the most friction are the ones that aren't going to survive. because it's their interoperability around working with other platforms and their data that's going to make it stronger.
Yeah, I totally agree. One of the things I want to really point out is at the end of the day, it's the customer, whether your customer is a business or your customer is the end consumer. You want them to win, and they win by getting the best tools in the market. And it's not, I don't think it's a matter of limiting the number of tools, because I really believe when the mainstream tools come in, and they will come in, and they are coming in, the solutions that are there today that aren't quite up to that standard because they're newer, they haven't been around 10, 15 years, they will be compelled to build better systems. And it's not going to kill all of them. It's going to make them build better products. And then the customer's going to win. And that's how it works outside of cannabis. And that's why you see the Zappiers of the world. Zapier has a gazillion competitors, and they're all unicorns. They're all doing well. And it's because external to cannabis has had these problems for years. We've had vendor lock-in. We've had, having to use a thing that does everything but doesn't do anything well. And you want to be able to choose that POS. I think I just was reading the Cannabis Media POS. There's 79 POSs. Most of them probably haven't heard of, but the ones that you have heard of, some will go away. But
So shocking when you're like, oh my God, another POS company. Who did the diligence on that?
But at the end of the day, there's not going to be one winner, I guess is what I'm trying to say. It's not going to be a winner take all in any of these verticals. And you're talking C2C, like our platform is C2C. We're not a C2C software the way that you think of it is. We are an integration layer, compliance layer. At the end of the day, we are a compliance engine. But we standardize that, but we do the data from seed all the way to sale, all the way even through the supply chain into financial.
I think maybe a good analogy is that, a cannabis brand in Massachusetts is very different than a cannabis brand in California. Even though they may sell the same product, they have different regulations, compliance to appease to different suppliers fundamentally. And if you have a clothing store, in the US, that's Massachusetts, and they can have like the same supply chain and it's the same product.
Right.
So my point being is that in the cannabis industry, customization is essential and innate to how these companies evolve. And, multi-state operators, like, I don't fundamentally believe that, cannabis companies only use cannabis tech. It's whatever it's what they need to move their business forward. And there is no one size fits all in this industry, period.
In any external to cannabis, you'll hear the term API economy. It's huge. And that's where cannabis is a nascent industry. They haven't quite adopted that yet. But what that means is it gives developers the ability to build these tools quicker, faster. So think about 15 years ago. No one would ever dream about putting their authentication, SSL, on a third party, ever. And now you have up to 50 million competitors. No one would dream of building that. If you're building enterprise software, unless you're building that, you're going to utilize top of the line authentication and authorization and security, and you're going to utilize the third party. Mm-hmm. And so that, for me, that is what helps bring it all together. Let the engineers build, let the internal teams, we're talking to operators that build their own tools, and they are utilizing mainstream ERPs.
Yeah.
They have bypassed everything. So they would like to utilize us for compliance. Like we want to integrate with our mainstream ERP.
I feel like where the industry started from software standpoint was not in infrastructure, but more of like quick fixes. So like, POS, seed to sale. And now we're kind of going backwards into like, oh wait, like we're maturing. We have so much more.
I actually have something
to support. And it's, it isn't necessarily evil, right, but it's also quite a bit of work.
The economies are not being reached in cannabis industry right now.
What did you say?
Scale economies. So it's just not unfolding. And I think that state by state limits it, and I accept that. But as we plan for the future, the complexities are going to be not only in operating at the state, but operating on a national basis. Because you're going to need to have platforms that can handle that. That I live in Pennsylvania. I buy the products. I can buy them from California because they're going to be cheaper and the quality I want. Right. And so being able to anticipate those types of complexities is the job of us today to figure it out and not wait for it to happen. I mean, I do believe it's firmly a matter of when, not if, that these things are going to fall in place. And when they fall in place very quickly, there's going to be a mad rush into reinventing the cannabis industry for the next piece of it. But I do think, and I hope the investors coming into that have an eye towards what the real goal is, right? It's making sure that you can make this part of a typical CPG type of environment that has the idiosyncrasies of the cannabis industry and always will have because of the lab results and the testing and the compliance and the enhanced taxation, which will come in as well federally when that hits. But yeah, I see the opportunity to kind of rebuild and reinvent a lot of the problems from happening because you can contemplate what they're going to be on a scale economy side.
I mean, you can look at like the alcohol industry, the pharmaceutical industry, and kind of see where they went. And I think for cannabis, at best, it'll mimic alcohol. It may actually be worse. And I'm speculating there because we don't know what will happen. But it's when federal legalization does happen, it's not going to get easier. It's going to get harder. It is going to be another layer.
It's going to be a shit show.
It's going to be a shit show.
Typically, when stuff like that happens, it gets really bad and dials back a little bit, gets a little bit better, but it's not going to go, oh, look, it's federal. Everything's all the same. It won't happen. And then you're going to think about the ATF and the FDA. And it gets complex. It gets really complex. And one of the things on the compliance level is cannabis companies have to think about more than just cannabis rules and regulations, especially when it goes federal. You better start thinking about HIPAA. Illinois is the only state I know that's requiring it right now, but it's going to be required. You've got to think of FedRAMP. If you're doing anything with government.
We haven't applied necessarily the federal regulations into our playbooks fully.
Yeah, no, there's a lot.
By state, local, regional.
Yeah, there's just a lot.
It's expensive. It's gonna be expensive.
It is.
It's going to be very well. Ideally, our type of platforms like ours and others will be there and available. And our goal is to make it dead simple and cheap.
I like that.
Inexpensive.
I agree with those two things.
Decrease the cost, increase the revenue, and maintain compliance.
Yeah.
And I know I just sounded like a salesperson, but I'm not. I'm an engineer, I swear. But that is what the API economy does for businesses.
It expands two different really strategic areas right now. That I see. One is your standard operating expenditures, right? And good data systems will help you operate more efficiently. But then there's the other piece of it that everyone tries to strategize around is like, what's my data environment and decision-making going to look like? Guys like Merrimack do a really good job of setting up the infrastructure from day one. It was Joe's employee number 7, right? And the strategy of getting there when you're a more fully formed organization, and then you want to start creating data environments, you need to have good data, right? And if you don't have systems with the transparency and auditing rights, you're going to get the garbage in, garbage out problem. And I always like to think that a data environment should help you ask a question more than it helps you answer one. Because the answers are going to be out there. If you have the environment that is comprehensive across your organizations, you can say, what if we did that? That's the real differentiator with forward-thinking data model in the cannabis industry.
So what are your thoughts? I know you have some questions.
There's a virtual question.
So
it says, companies often have to sacrifice speed to market to reduce technical debt. Is some technical debt okay to get your product to market, and what is there too much?
That's a great question. Some technical debt is okay. That's kind of a
In terms of,
lean startup kind of mode. And that's what I think we were both alluding to when we said there's always going to be some. But that's what I meant by like have the vision of where you're going. And then iterate, constantly iterate, refactor as you're going and iterate. There's the famous visual for the MVP with the, what is it, the skateboard, the scooter, the car, etc. That's real. And people really do develop against that. And ideally, you're not creating too much tech debt. But if you're doing a startup and you have no tech debt, you're doing it wrong. You're doing it wrong. But what you don't want is to throw it all away. And to say, when is it too much? That's a bit of a subjective thing in your own personal taste, I guess.
Yeah.
You have.
I would add to that and just say, it's inevitable. But as you see it being created and you know it, you're like, I'm kind of fudging this little area here that I need to do. Make a plan to remediate it and have ideas about how and when you're going to be able to address that tech debt before or after you get past the point where it gets really hard to do it.
name and company, but I'll start with you.
Curious, just listening to your guys' solutions, it sounds like a lot of your clients, so there's things that may not be sophisticated, to even understand some of the problems that you guys are facing. How do you overcome that sales process that they understand value?
So I'm going to repeat the question just for the audience. The question, I'm so sorry, I forgot your name. Kurt from Seed Talent. I remembered that. Was around sell-through process. And it's a major thing that I've seen with talking to every tech company in the industry is that just maturity level of the end customer with these platforms and how they make that decision. It's challenging. Yeah. What have you guys experienced and how do you feel like that is changing over time?
I would like to answer this. For me, our user is an engineer. So typically when we're going through the sales process, we try to get to that person, or at least in the chain. We haven't. I've been with the head of compliance and they have absolutely no idea, because when they finally understand what we do, they go, oh, that's my engineering team. And then we get them. But when I'm talking to anyone technical in the company, whether that's a product person, an engineering person, or a sales engineer, they get it right away. And they get, the problem is like, problem we're solving, everybody's experiencing.
Yeah.
So they're spending enormous amounts of money and time and not focusing on their core product. And so they do get it. They do get it. And we do demos so that they can see it in action. Although we're APIs, so we have to do a presentation for the non-technical people in the room. And then we go right into Postman. If there are any technical people in the audience, that's a developer tool for creating and managing APIs. And then the technical person in the demo can see, and they may like, oh, and they get it right away.
Yeah, but I think at its core, the cannabis industry is heavily retail, right? So like not really resourced with digital technical people. Right. At the C-suite. We only have very few MSOs or enterprise companies that have like a head of tech CTO, maybe an engineering person that's a manager, rarely director or consultants. So when I see companies trying to sell through, I'm like, who's your point person making the buying decision? But like, we go through the COO, CFO, CEO, and then they're kind of like, well, who does this at our org? And then you just get like pushed around in a circle. And then somehow someone's like, yeah, we just get stuck most of the time. So I've seen that a lot of companies, software companies, they have to have a consulting arm, even the POSs, because it's a discovery and audit process before you have to sell. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we sell solutions, yeah. And across multiple industries. I've always found business managers at any level can articulate what their pinch points are. Right, and so I need this. A lot of times when you talk about pinch points, I'll talk to a CEO and they'll say, "I need AI." Like, whoa, that's pretty aggressive. Why do you need AI? And he says, "Well, we just need to know more." And when you start talking about like, well, do you have a database? Do you have records? Do you have this, that? No, but I just want AI, right? They want to get to that point. And if you have a comprehensive data strategy, it should always start with operations. Right? It should collect the data that helps you make your decisions around each of your operating points, whether it's inventory flow, accounting, all of that, who your customers are. And then you can build the environment to say, okay, what kind of questions do I want to answer? In a retail store, who's my best customer when they walk in the door? Is it a function of their deep business? Are they buying high margin products? Are they, any number of factors? But then you get the dialogue to say, okay, the data environment should help us address all of these issues and then go from there. A lot of times it's not that way, and it's largely because they don't have technology infrastructure and teams. And so when they hear the buzzword out there, like everyone's doing AI, we need that too. And like you guys have a spreadsheet with 2,000 rows on it, right? Keep it in the spreadsheet and until you want to do something else.
I would argue though that there are a lot of vertically integrated MSOs and SSOs that have their own engineering teams. This is what I heard early on, and I've seen play out as I meet and speak with people and these companies, is that they try 1, 2, or 3, and they either just settle for the third because they're done, or they build their own.
So time for 1, 2 more questions.
This EASL questions for Helene, but also the other panelists. In terms of this industry, when it moves to descheduled interstate commerce and sort of the doors open up, what is the role for existing vertical software solutions versus general industry horizontal solutions?
That's a great question. So
does that change the market in that eventually?
got a question from EASL regarding horizontal versus vertical software solutions. And once federal legalization happens, and we start to hit like scale in the US, what I think the ecosystem looks like. If you look at traditional tech, there's actually a pretty big carve out for vertical SaaS, like VCs, in terms of, let's call it the restaurant industry, right? Like Toast came to market. Now they're plowing through into the cannabis market through Dutchy. And I think every industry has its nuance, especially if it's a regulated market. But there's always going to be a mixture of both. I believe that this is an M&A market, not an IPO market. So a lot of these outside industry, the Oracles, I don't know if it's Salesforce, maybe HubSpot, they will build a division to service the sector and most likely do M&A because one, they can acqui-hire faster, maybe book of business matters, maybe not, but the more of the pain of just like getting the quick compliance. And for them, it's like, some of these companies are like double like decacorn market cap. Like this is just a nice little subsector for us, but also big and global. So I do think that there's a hybrid, but I do like vertical SaaS companies. At JourneyOne, my thesis is that, I like deals that have the ability to use cannabis as like a go-to-market, but can service other highly regulated, potentially tangential markets. So we invested in a company called Amnesia. They're a regulatory marketing compliance platform that ingests like social posts and provides a risk score on the likelihood of that post being shut down by using AI to essentially take in the platform like Facebook, Instagram's compliance measures mixed with like state measures. But if you look at like the sexual wellness industry, alcohol industry, tobacco and psychedelics, all of those sectors deal with the same problems that cannabis does. But this company is sandboxing in cannabis. There's a huge demand. And so my point being is that like, this company has legs to go horizontal outside of cannabis into other industries. But that's my thesis. I think we're out of time, unfortunately. But thank you, Delta Emerald, for hosting.
Great conference.
Happy Friday.
Great. Thank you so much.